Hello, I'm Liz Van Vliet, and welcome to the Assist with Impact podcast. Join me as I explore the competencies and capabilities that allow you to assist with impact. I'll be sharing practical tips, strategies, and insights that will help you move beyond what I call the order taker zone and be that little hinge that can swing big doors. If you're ready to be more proactive and have more impact in your role, then this is the place for you. Let's get started with the episode. Well, hello, lovely listeners. Welcome to episode 161 of the Assist with Impact podcast, previously known as Being Indispensable. Now, this week's episode is a solo episode, and what I'm going to share with you is an article that I have just recently read in the Harvard Business Review, written by a lady called Liz Wiseman. Now, she might be familiar to you if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, because I have previously done an episode talking about a book that she wrote last year called Impact Players. In that book, Liz Wiseman shared research that had been done with, I think it was around 200 sort of Fortune, 200 organisations in the United States, where she shared feedback from managers of what distinguishes what she describes as impact players from people that are described as having a contributor mindset. Now, I read this article in the Harvard Business Review, and I'm going to share it with you because I think it is really relevant to you as assistants, and it has particular resonance for me because of when you hear the title of the article, you'll understand why. So it's in the career planning part of the Harvard Business Review online section. And the title of the article is, Should You Really Be Indispensable at Work? And she poses that as a question. The article is dated September 20th, 2022. So it's very recent. And as you will have no doubt worked out, the resonance that has with me is because this podcast used to be called Being Indispensable. Now, I'm going to read the article and then I'm going to share with you why, for those of you that haven't been listening to the podcast for that long, why the podcast was called Being Indispensable and what was behind that. And then secondly, why I decided to change the title of the podcast. So let me start by reading you this article, which is obviously going to be available as a link in the show notes, but I won't read the entire thing, but I will just read you some extracts from it. So let me read you the summary of the article to start with. It goes, Ever felt like your desire to have work matter and make an impact is translating into a drive to make yourself indispensable? The quest to be absolutely necessary is often limiting, both for the individual and the organisation. Making yourself irreplaceable can tether you to your job and compromise your well-being. Additionally, it reduces potential for growth. If no one else can handle your job, you won't be able to step up into new opportunities as they arise. There are important implications for your success as a leader. When you position yourself as a gatekeeper or go-to person, it's easy to become a know-it-all and limit your effectiveness. You can deem yourself so vital that you become diminishing. Someone who is smart and capable, but who shuts down the intelligence and capabilities of the people who you lead. Instead, look to becoming valuable. The most valuable contributors pay attention to what's important and do the job that needs to be done right now. Your value at work will grow if you replicate yourself rather than protect your scarce skills. So I hope you can see straight away why I felt like this was such a valuable article to share with you, because it really is speaking to that challenge and that dilemma that assistants can find themselves in, where they feel like they have made themselves irreplaceable. So I'm going to read you a little bit more of the article. This is a part of the article where she talks about when being indispensable backfires. And she uses an example of an HR manager at a high growth tech startup. And she talks about how this person had her hands in everything and she was literally the go-to person. But as the company grew and HR responsibilities expanded, this person couldn't let go of the reins. She had to be across everything. And what that resulted in is that I don't know how you describe this. She was hamstrung, her staff felt hamstrung by the fact that she was really only allowing them to work on menial tasks, and she had a high level of attrition. So, as she said in the introduction, making yourself irreplaceable is going to tether you to your job and it's going to compromise your well-being. She also talks about and gives some tips in this article about how to be valuable at work. And this is really where she's referencing stuff from her book, Impact Players. She says that the most valuable contributors pay attention to what's important and do the job that needs to be done right now. They aren't just experts and know-it-alls. They're learn-it-alls who adapt and change as the needs of the organisation change. They look to eliminate bottlenecks and reduce friction points that slow down progress. And perhaps most importantly, their value doesn't just come from the work they do themselves. They are integral to teams, a part of a larger whole, and their presence helps to maximise and multiply the talents of the entire groups. So that's what I want you to take on board in terms of how this applies to you as an assistant, is that you have that capacity to lead from where you are, to be able to have that big picture view, get up onto that balcony and see where there are potential bottlenecks and friction points and use those power skills that I talk about in order for you to be able to be effective in reducing and mitigating those obstacles and barriers. She recommends in this article to start practicing 3 things. And they're things that I have talked about in previous podcast episodes that I'm also a big fan of. So the first one is to figure out what needs to be done and do it without being asked. So that's speaking to you being a proactive linchpin assistant. The next one she talks about is filling a leadership vacuum, looking for situations that lack clear leadership and step up to fill the void. So, some examples of that are unclear meetings. It's estimated that 63% of meetings have no planned agenda. So when you see this happening, that's an opportunity for you to take charge and provide clarity for the meeting, the group that's involved in the meeting, to set and agree on an intended outcome for that meeting. In doing so, you are going to be helping to protect the time and energy of your leader, but also the time and energy of the other people in the team and the broader organisation. And then finally, she talks about unsung heroes. Most employees express a need to be recognised by their boss, by their peers and their clients. However, she cites a Glassdoor survey where only 2/3 of employees said that their bosses showed them enough appreciation. So that's something that you can be aware of in terms of how your boss, how your leader is demonstrating their appreciation for what you do. But you can also demonstrate your leadership in terms of speaking up and filling that void by recognising the contributions of your peers or collaborators, other assistants, other members of the team who are working behind the scene. And that's also going to result in that other thing that I've talked about in this podcast, which is reciprocity, building reciprocity, that it's going to be creating the mindset and the expectation that this is the way you behave. Your expectation is that others are also going to behave that way too. And that what she says here is that research shows that amplifying others' voices boosts your own status and engenders the trust that you need to lead without authority. So it's literally as simple as saying in public, in a meeting, to a group or to your leader, I just wanted to take a moment to thank X person for X activity or thing that they did in the last week or in the last few days or in the last month, and then talk about the outcome that has resulted in, how it's helped you, how it's helped the team. So, as I said, I will put the link to this HBR article, Harvard Business Review article, in the show notes, but I hope that's given you a flavour for what she's talking about in terms of whether or not you really want to be making yourself indispensable at work. Now, as I said at the start of this episode, I said that I would share with you how this is really relevant to me because this podcast used to be called Being Indispensable. Now, the irony is that it was never intended to be taken literally. When I was setting out on my podcast journey over 6 years ago, I did a survey on LinkedIn and asked in a number of groups for assistants, personal assistants, admin assistants, EAs, every assistant group that I could find. And I asked them to give me one word to describe how they wanted to show up at work. And I kept a running word, actually it was an Excel spreadsheet, tabulating the responses. And that ironically, the word that came out as the number one word was indispensable. And I named my podcast Being Indispensable. And I used to say in my introduction that I knew better than anybody that wanting to be indispensable was unrealistic and actually unhelpful because we are all dispensable. And for me, that reality set in when I was diagnosed with breast cancer and went through my treatment and my recovery. So the title Being Indispensable was always meant to talk to or speak to that conflict between wanting to be perceived as, at the time, what I was hearing from assistants being perceived as indispensable, but recognizing that we are human beings not human doings. And so in the time that the podcast was called Being Indispensable, I was constantly reminding my listeners that I did not want you to set yourself up as irreplaceable. What I wanted you to do was to be able to demonstrate your value, to be able to articulate your value, and to be able to amplify your accomplishments, as one of my other favourite people, Jo Miller, talks about in her book, Woman of Influence. So I'm going to finish this episode by just reinforcing that I am in complete agreement with Liz Wiseman, that I don't want you to be making yourself indispensable at work, because situations change, you change. You want to always be positioning yourself for the potential of another move, for your next move, whether or not that means changing jobs or changing responsibilities, and finding ways to continue to thrive, not just survive in your work as an assistant. And I want to leave you not just with that recommendation for Liz Wiseman's brilliant book, Impact Players, which I will put a link to in the show notes, and I will also put a link to the episode where I talked about the book on this podcast. I will also put a link to Jo Miller's book, Woman of Influence, and no disrespect to my wonderful male listeners or people that identify as they, them, listeners that I have for my podcast, because I'm, as you know, I'm all about diversity and inclusion. But Jo's book is called Woman of Influence. It doesn't mean that the same tips that she talks about cannot be adopted by you if you identify as something other than she, her. I'm also going to put a link to another book that I've previously mentioned on the podcast and interviewed the author, Andrea Clarke, called Future Fit. And again, I will put all those links in the show notes so that you have a plethora, a literal cornucopia of resources to go back and remind yourself of how I want you to be seeing yourself as not just surviving, but thriving in your personal and in your professional life. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I will look forward to bringing you another episode in another 2 weeks' time, which is actually an interview that I have recently done, which I'm really looking forward to sharing with you. Thanks for listening. Thanks for listening to today's show. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see the show notes, head over to my website. It would be great if you haven't already done so. If you enjoyed the show, if you could kindly go to iTunes and leave a review. It helps other people find the show. Thanks for listening, and have a great week.